The Gospel of John records Jesus' last words before dying on the cross as, "It is finished." No doubt, all those who witnessed his death were convinced that they heard Jesus' last words. So on Easter morning, when Mary Magdalene and Peter arrived at the tomb, they were expecting to find Jesus' dead body. When they found the tomb empty, they searched inside and outside. Mary naturally assumed that someone had taken his body. This is a reasonable conclusion, of course. And while it was surprising that Jesus' body was missing, what happened next to Mary was even more surprising. Instead of finding Jesus' lifeless body, she heard Jesus' voice again. His speaking wasn't finished after all. Jesus called her by name, and she recognized that what he had promised before the cross had come true. He had been raised from the dead. Mary wasn't the only person who had heard Jesus say, "It is finished." His disciples had heard those words as well, and their surprise was as great as Mary's when Jesus showed up in a room with the doors locked. In the midst of being huddled together, afraid for their lives, Jesus shocked them by saying, "Peace be with you." As the Gospel of John tells it, Jesus' disciple Thomas wasn't in that room to hear Jesus' voice, and when he was told by the others what had happened, he said he couldn't believe they'd heard his voice. He wouldn't believe Jesus had been resurrected until he saw and heard it for himself. What was stuck in his head was the image of Jesus' brutal death, the scars in his hands, the pierced side, the brutality of Jesus' death on the cross. So Thomas said, "Unless I can touch those wounds, I will never believe." And so Jesus showed up again in that same locked room, this time with Thomas there too, and told Thomas to touch the wounds in Jesus' body. He demonstrated to Thomas and to all of the disciples that what he had promised to all of them before his death was true. And Jesus' appearances in the locked room weren't isolated instances. He appeared to others who had witnessed the tragedy of the cross. On the road to Emmaus, 2 disciples were on their way back to their communities and the lives they'd been leading before becoming Jesus' disciples, when Jesus showed up and walked with them on the road. They didn't recognize him at first, but while they were all eating dinner that evening, Jesus explained again what he had promised, and their eyes and ears were opened to recognize him as the resurrected Christ. Later on, as the disciples were fishing on the sea, Jesus showed up on the shore to greet them, and in an act of demonstrating he was alive and well, he ate fish with them as he reminded them of his promises. But Jesus wasn't raised from the dead simply to prove to everyone he was alive. He was raised from the dead as the fulfillment of the promise God made to Adam and Eve back in the Garden of Eden after they fell for the serpent's lies, that God would send his seed, Jesus Christ, to crush the head of the serpent, to defeat sin, death, and the devil for all those who receive that promise from God. To be sure, the disciples who encountered Jesus after his resurrection were profoundly impacted. But the impact of Jesus' resurrection wasn't for them alone. In fact, Jesus commanded those first witnesses of his resurrection to go out and witness to all nations. So, generation after generation to this very day, God has sent witnesses to make sure that you know that death does not have the final word over you, and that you will know the power of Jesus' resurrection, hear his promise of forgiveness, and hear his voice again when he comes again to raise his baptized children to eternal life.